All right. Okay. All right. My name is Roger Bergman. I would like to invite you all to join us in this adventure of the energy and environment um, talk this evening, this community discussion regarding the environment concerns of the energy for Grand Haven and specifically for Harbor Island. So we have panelists this evening. We have three panelists. Actually, we have four, and I'll introduce the fourth one later on. But the first three, the first one is Paul Sachs. Paul is Director of Planning and Performance Improvement for Ottawa County, where he's responsible for implementing innovative and pragmatic solutions that positively impact the quality of life and economic growth in the county. He's a Michigan native, and he was born and raised in Royal Oak, attended West Michigan University, lives with his wife and two daughters in Holland. He previously worked as a researcher for the Federal Highway Administration Research and Technology Center in Virginia, and then also worked for FEMA in Washington, D.C. Our second panelist is Eric Nordman. He has a PhD and is a professor of natural resource management at Grand Valley State University. Teaches courses in conduct and conducts research in natural resource policy and environmental economics. During his 2019-2020 sabbatical, he was a visiting scholar at Indiana University Ostrom Workshop. He's written numerous articles for diverse audiences on the social and economic aspects of renewable energy and environmental stewardship. In 2012, he was awarded a Fulbright Scholar grant to teach and conduct research at Kenyatta University in Nairobi, Kenya. Our third panelist is Ken Walters. Kent Walters is his third year working for the Michigan Department of Environmental, Great Lakes and Energy, EGLE, working as a materials management division as the district geologist for the Grand Rapids district. Kent works primarily with active and closed landfills across West Michigan, reviewing hydrogeological investigations and providing environmental guidance and oversight. He's currently kept busy with overseeing PFAS groundwater investigations and closure of coal combustion residual impoundments at power producing facilities. He is also an active contributor and member of the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, providing technical insight into PFAS groundwater investigations. Prior to being with EGLE, he spent 3 years as a geologist in environmental consulting and spent a summer producing geological maps for the National Park Service. After producing introductions, I would like to mention that this is the third of 3 community discussions. We've had nearly 100 participating in our last meeting. Local businesses and the newspaper are paying more attention to the issues involved with energy supply. Grand Haven Energy Organization is a group of local citizens making the effort to let you and others know what is going on. You can find out more information at ghenergy.org. We are a no budget organization. If you'd be willing to help and can make a modest contribution, we are asking individuals to underwrite some of our expenses. If you're willing to help out, you could see Phil Reichard or let him know at some point in time. Obviously, he isn't on this Zoom, nor are we meeting together tonight. So one of the things that we are trying to do is bring community awareness to VLP's plans for Harbor Island. We have 3 major points for consideration. We feel whatever is done must be economically and physically the right decision for our community. As the Board of Light and Power is a publicly owned utility, we feel its decisions should respect environmental responsibility. This meeting today is to discuss this issue, both with the use of Harbor Island and the use of natural methane gas as a fuel. And the third thing is that we feel a significant factor in planning for electricity supply for Grand Haven should be a forward look at the technological increases and cost decreases in the supply of renewable energy and energy storage. From our first two meetings, we learned the following points. The BLP is committing to a 30-year bond on technology that may become obsolete and may not be the wisest thing to do. The governor of Michigan has set a goal for the state to be carbon neutral by 2050. This bond won't yet be paid off by 2050. New innovations have a curve for development that eventually plateaus. Solar technology is on a steep curve up right now, and changes are expected to be frequent for at least the next 5 years. Currently, batteries are expensive and not long-lasting, and not a long-lasting solution, but this is expected to change. We only have to think about what Ford Motor and GM and the other car manufacturing companies are doing in terms of battery technology that's looking into for electric vehicles going into the future. Once a 12.5 gas-fired generation plant is built, the flexibility to adapt to changes is greatly reduced. We also know that when burned, coal is a very dirty fossil fuel that produces carbon dioxide, bad for the environment. Natural gas is a cleaner fossil fuel when you are talking about emissions from the plant. But the extraction process for making gas has many reasons for concern. And one of them is that methane is over 80% more lethal as a greenhouse gas than CO2. Fracking is a process by which natural gas is extracted. Fracking is controversial because, among other reasons, the potential cancer-causing chemicals used to extract oil and gas, which can then contaminate local water supplies. And natural gas is not a renewable source of energy. But there are other environmental considerations related to Harbor Island that we want to discuss tonight. As you can see from some of the shots from the past, and we're going to see those in just a minute. As you can see from some of these shots, you can see that at one time, the Harbor Island was used for logging. It was also used for many, many years as a dump site. And the picture in the top left-hand side shows actually some of the dump being burned up. So it was also a site that was often had some fire on it. In addition, back in the 80s and 90s, the island was used as a dredging site for the river. The river's dredging was deposited by the Army Corps of Engineers over a period of years on Harbor Island. With the high water levels, we are experiencing a larger percentage of the island underwater. So perhaps a great place to start might be asking the following questions. And I'm going to ask these of Kent, who is our representative here from Eagle. Two questions. What are the BLP's legal obligations to clean up the site? And what is the time frame for completing the cleanup?
Yeah, so what I'll be talking about, what outlining specifically, is related to waste generated from the power producing plant. So like the photo that you saw earlier with the historic dump, I won't be covering any of that. This is specifically wastes that were produced from the power plant. So when we jump into things, there's two sets of legal obligations that the BLP needs to follow in the closure of the site. Back in 2015, EPA came out with 40 CFR Part 257, which is basically just a fancy way of saying they started regulations for coal combustion residuals, or coal ash, in CCR impoundments, like the formerly active impoundments and the historic impoundments on site. And the other one that we need to consider, in 2018, Michigan's Public Act 640, which amended Part 115, which is basically the solid waste rules and regulations for Michigan. They amended it to include coal ash impoundments, that Eagle would be able to directly regulate coal ash impoundments, like what we see on the site, the formerly active impoundments that the BLP was using. So EPA CCR rules came into effect in 2015, and they were self-implementing, which means they were carrying out these rules by themselves. So what does that mean? The BLP is required to do a variety of things, some of them including like stability reports of the ash lagoons to make sure they weren't imminent of collapsing or failure, spewing coal ash out everywhere. Engineering reports, documentations of liners, scheduled inspections, dust control, et cetera, stuff like that. Some of the bigger things that they're required to do are groundwater investigations and ultimate closure of the coal ash ponds, or the CCR ponds. So when Michigan's rules came into effect in 2018, December of 2018, like I said earlier, that means that Eagle can directly regulate these coal ash ponds. So what does that mean? Well, a lot of what's required in EPA rules is also the same for Michigan, and Michigan's rules even reference EPA's rules quite a bit when you get into the details. Some similarities in groundwater monitoring, closure deadlines, and stuff like that. Some of the differences that I'll highlight are Michigan's rules say that if there's exceedances in groundwater detected from the coal ash impoundments, that it needs to cease accepting waste within 180 days. Another one would be Michigan requires a larger subset of groundwater monitoring parameters. And Michigan requires the facility to be licensed if it has not closed the coal ash ponds by December 28 of this year, 2020. So that's just a quick outline of sort of the regulatory aspect. So what is Eagle currently involved with at the site? Well, we're involved with the groundwater monitoring network. The BLP has developed a monitoring network across the site. However, Eagle has informed the BLP that it doesn't agree with its current monitoring network. It needs a little bit more work to it. Some additional information needs to be gathered. EPA has also informed the BLP that it's unclear if their monitoring network meets the federal sets of requirements. We're also involved with the coal ash and CCR impoundment closures. Eagle's in the process of reviewing the BLP's closure work plan for the formerly active coal ash impoundments, and we're in the process of providing comments back to them describing our concerns and insufficiencies with the proposed plan. And Eagle is also working with EPA to figure out a path forward to close the historic CCR ponds, and that review is still in process. The BLP also, if you look through the Part 115 CCR rules, there's documents that are required, and we're still waiting from the BLP for some documents, we'll hopefully receive those in the future. So what has been found in the groundwater at site? Well, groundwater testing has revealed contaminants above groundwater protection standards. Boron, chloride, fluoride, sulfate, total dissolved solids, antimony, arsenic, cadmium, chromium, cobalt, lead, lithium. They've all been detected above Michigan groundwater quality standards at some point or another. In my experience, boron and lithium are some of the most common contaminants that are associated with coal ash ponds. Just looking at the ash ponds that I've been dealing with here in West Michigan. On this site, boron and lithium are detected most frequently, I would say, and are detected at elevated concentrations in respect to their groundwater quality standards. Basically, what is required because of these detections in groundwater, these exceedances in groundwater? Well, there's various documents that are required, but the end goal is obviously remediation. To put it most concisely, that would just mean a plan that would basically, the BOP would need to provide a plan that would give a path forward to how we are making sure that the island isn't impacting human health or the environment, or negatively impacting human health or the environment. So what's currently planned for the coal ash impoundments at the site? Well, like I said, ultimately closure for the historic and recently active ponds. The BOP is in the process of closing their formerly active units near the plant. They have chosen to do complete closure by removal of those ponds, which basically means they're digging up the waste and bringing those wastes to landfill. The BOP has informed EPA and Eagle that they would like to close the historic coal ash pond in place. And basically what that means is exactly how it sounds, that they would like to leave the waste presently in the ground from the impoundment in the ground. But EPA and Eagle have been reviewing this new information and is in the process of providing BOP questions, concerns, guidance, and issues with the proposed plan. So that basically, hopefully didn't bore people too much. It was kind of a lengthy response for the first question. Roger, do you want me just to jump in the second one, or do you want to reframe the question?
Yeah, no, that's fine. But before you continue, though, I forgot to mention to the audience that we're taking questions at Grand Haven Energy at YouTube, their YouTube page. So if you go to Grand Haven Energy YouTube page, you should be able to answer or put in some questions on that page, and then those questions will be forwarded to myself or the participants, and then we'll answer those questions later on in the presentation. So Kent, go ahead. Well, I just have one question while you're talking.
Sure.
So if they leave one of the ponds there, is what you're saying, or one of the areas there, can they cap that with a certain, is there a way to cap it so that and make it so that it's just an area of wildlife for the future? Is that what their intent is? Is that what can be done?
Oh, there is a way to do that. However, one of the problems is in the federal CCR guidelines, it says you need to limit the amount of water that basically percolates or infiltrates through the waste.
Okay. Sure.
So given that most of that waste is already in the groundwater, it would probably be pretty difficult to do that, because obviously the way that contaminants get out of the waste is, it leaches off. Think of like your coffee grinds, you pour water through it and then you got your coffee. It's same with waste. You pour water through a waste and generally you get stuff that sort of leaches off of it.
Right.
So if they were to dig it up and, place it above groundwater and then cap it, that might be an option. But like I said, we're still working with the EPA to figure out basically, a path forward for that portion of the island.
Okay. All right. You want to go ahead with the second question? Time frame? Yeah.
Yep. So timeframes, and I'm sort of going to break it up here into two. So two sections. The formerly active ponds that I'm referring to are the ones that the power plant was using most recently. The ones that are sort of up higher on those berms. like I said earlier, the BOP is trying to achieve closure by removal before the end of this year. In Michigan rules, it says if they do not achieve closure by the end of this year, they need to obtain a 5-year solid waste license for the facility. And so for for timeline purposes, time frame closure purposes, it says that indicates that a facility needs to start closure of the impoundments within 6 months of final waste placement. So I believe the BOP has done that. Once they stopped using those formerly active ponds, they started closure process. But once the closure process has begun, they would have up to 5 years to complete that closure. So that basically covers, you know, the formerly active ponds.
Okay.
So looking at the historic ponds, you know, the BLP has proposed to leave those that historic ponds waste in place, and closure requirements and options for the closure of historic ash impoundments are being reviewed by Eagle and EPA at this point. So if you're familiar at all with EPA's federal guidelines, there's a lot of different paths you can go down. And depending on really what is the final option for this depends on timeframes. So I can't give at this point an exact time frame for the historic one because we're still working out some of the issues for the some of the issues related to that pond. So I can't give a specific timeline for that, unfortunately.
All right. So Eric, I'm wondering if you have any questions that you might have asked of Kent. I see that you're absorbing this pretty well. Do you have anything to add to what Kent has been responding to, or any questions you might have of him?
Yeah, you mentioned a whole bunch of heavy metals like boron and arsenic and cadmium. Would you mind telling the audience a little bit about, like, what are the health impacts of heavy metals in water, and what is the threat, since, I mean, if those are flowing downstream towards Lake Michigan, and that's where we're getting our drinking water, are there any concerns about potential contamination?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, they're called the Michigan Part 201 groundwater quality standards, which is basically just a subset of information that says if this contaminant is above this level, it could be potentially harmful to either human health, organic, or like small wildlife and waterways, or even plant life. So, like, for example, boron is found at very high concentrations in groundwater at the site. However, boron's criteria is based off of plant health. So it's basically, if you were to have boron above 500 parts per billion for this in this example, that it may be harmful to certain plant life. Mm-hmm. Arsenic is, you know, probably one that a lot of people are familiar with, just because arsenic can be naturally occurring across Michigan. But arsenic, you know, it can be a carcinogen, which means it can cause cancer. But we have to remember that there's a difference between groundwater and surface water. You know, what's in the groundwater, you can find it in fairly high concentrations. Groundwater moves very slowly. Surface water has a lot more volume, has a lot more flux. So just because you see arsenic or other contaminants in the groundwater does not mean that you'll find it in the surface water.
Okay.
So maybe that segue. Okay. So maybe that's a good segue into our next question, which is about the water levels in the coming years. And I think Paul and Eric, I don't know if you guys, Paul, were you able to contact the Army Corps at all about that question?
Well, it's a straightforward question, Roger, but it's fairly complex to answer. So maybe I'll take a shot at it.
Okay.
And then I'll see what Eric may have to add to it. Now, we know that water levels fluctuate, right, in Lake Michigan. And there have been scientific monitors on water levels since the early 1900s. And looking at that data, and look at the longitudinal trends, there are these short-term fluctuations in water levels that happen about every 30, 35 years. And I think people probably know in this area especially that the last high water levels of Lake Michigan were 1986, and we were at about 582 feet above sea level. Then in 2013, we had near record low water levels at about 576 feet above sea level. The 6 foot difference, that's a lot of volume transfer. It's incredible, trillions of gallons of water. Then just a short time period later, only 7 years later, here we are in 2020, we've got record high water levels in Lake Michigan. We're at about 583 feet. Well, and suffice it to say, it's very hard to predict what water levels are going to do. And it's due to the fact that those water levels are really tied to our weather patterns, and our weather patterns are becoming much more erratic. And historically, yeah, we've had extreme variations in weather patterns over time, but the concern we're facing now, especially in Ottawa County, is that we're seeing these erratic patterns happen more frequently. You take this year, for example, in Ottawa County, just in the Grand Haven area in the northwest part of the county, this past spring, we had extensive flooding. Ottawa County had to declare a local state of emergency. We had 4 inches of rain over a very short period of time. And I think overall, our average has maybe 120% increase in annual rainfall this year. And that really puts a strain on your natural and your built environment and our floodplains, 100-year floodplains. It's not a 100-year event anymore. People might not realize that. It's happening more frequently, every several years. And that increase in precipitation, it's tied to our weather patterns. You look at winters, for example. So we get warmer in our winters, we have less ice cover on Lake Michigan. That exposes more surface area. We get more evapotranspiration, resulting in more precip in our area. And we can feel that. I mean, that we see it, we feel it, we experience it. And I think we've increased our winter average temperature in Michigan since 1955 has gone up several degrees. We're averaging about 22 degrees Fahrenheit. That results in excessive spring flooding. We get that in Ottawa County, and we've also seen islands, land masses in the Grand River disappear. I mean, that's happening right now. Go on the bridge in Grand Haven, you look east, there were some former land masses in the water. They're completely submerged. Several years ago, the County Parks Department did an invasive species assessment for Phragmites on those land masses. They're gone. You can see some little tips of them. We ultimately know that fluctuation will come back. Those islands will start to resurface, but invariably they're going to disappear again. And we see that on the impacts even on Harbor Island. There are some old historic photos, right? If you look at some of the lower water levels in Lake Michigan, about 140 acres, I believe, of Harbor Island with low water levels. We start to get higher water levels and it impacts it 10, 15%. You're less than 120 acres. And the last parts I want to add to this is it's that dynamic water level environment, that's the reason the city of Grand Haven invested money in 2016 to build a coastal resiliency plan. And that master plan for the city, it's designed to plan for and protect those vulnerable assets of the city. And it even says in that plan that it's important to have appropriate construction of infrastructure and facilities. And that plan also recognizes that variability in water levels, and especially in those low-lying susceptible areas of where the wetlands are, where Harbor Island is, along the entire waterfront, incredibly vulnerable. I think as a whole, we recognize a wetland potential of what, and I think we're going to touch on this a little bit later in the conversation. Protecting those areas is really important. I think especially if we talk about doing some redevelopment and remediation on Harbor Island, I think you seriously need to look at and evaluate the environmental susceptibility and vulnerability of this area, and potentially even get in touch with the professional planning staff of City of Grand Haven Community Development Department, because they administer that coastal resiliency management plan for the city that really deals with these predictions. That plan includes expected predictions of what will happen in the Grand River. And ultimately, those predictions in that plan show that an industrial zoned area of Harbor Island fully impacted based on where the trends are going.
Thanks. Eric, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, Paul did a great job summarizing it. I would just add that, he talked about the fluctuations in the water levels, and that's over the last 10 years was really driven by increases in precipitation. And as our temperature, especially winter temperatures, get warmer, you have more evaporation off of those lakes too. So the lake levels are really in this tension between, lots of precipitation. As the air gets warmer, it holds more moisture, it rains more. So we see that. But as the lake gets warmer, you have more evaporation too. So they're always in this dynamic tension. Over the last 10 years, we were in the wettest period on record. And like Paul said, that went from a record low level to a record high level in just a decade. But if that flips just a little bit and if evaporation wins out, those water levels could go down again very quickly. So there's a, constant tension, and that's likely, the best estimates that I've seen show that that's likely to continue and be much more dynamic over the next 10 years. Where they're going to end up, are they going to be continued high or even higher? I don't know, and I don't know if anybody knows, but more variation and these really quick swings from high to low are probably something to be expected, which makes it really difficult to manage. If we, if you can say, well, it's going to be at this level, then we can plan and build for that. But when it's constantly seesawing, that makes it a lot more tricky.
Definitely does.
And I'll just add one more thing about downtown Grand Haven, not on Harbor Island, but the Chinook Pier. We had all those shops down at the Chinook Pier, and the high water levels underneath there got in, caused all kinds of mold, and those buildings had to be demolished. So that's a place that I used to shop. I took my kids there to get ice cream. Even our realtor owned a shop there where we bought it from whom we bought our house. So those, buildings have a lot of history and connection to people, and that's a loss to the community because of these high water levels.
So I have a question related to this for Kent. So a minute ago, you were talking about how the the water kind of the runoff on the surface is much greater than the bleeding into the water supply from the bottom, correct? So when we see these fluctuations in water levels, and if you look at Harbor Island, if you would have taken a picture of it this summer, you would have seen that a very large percentage of the island was water. And so consequently, we've got water sitting, moving around in these areas where instead of slowly getting into the water supply, it's getting in very quickly, correct?
Well, I mean, the waste that is at the site is in the ground, so it's not directly in contact with surface waters. So the way for that those contaminants to get to surface waters is to travel through groundwater. Now, the lake level surely put that lake level or those surface water levels very close to some areas in the site. I was there in September, and the water levels were maybe about this far away from the main road that went into the power plant. It was pretty astounding. That was also after we had a significant rain event. So the Grand River levels were also at a flood stage, so it kind of exacerbated things. But the waste is in the ground and in the groundwater, and in those contaminants, they move through the groundwater, at much slower than most people realize, and then they eventually vent into surface waters.
Right. Okay. All right. So my next question is regarding the county's plans for Ottawa Sands recreation area, and I'm asking the question: what impact could decisions made on the island have on how the area might be used in the future? So I'll start with asking Paul, because he works for the county. What do you see in terms of, it's a beautiful new area, this recreation area, and it overlooks the island, correct? And so what are your thoughts about that?
So, as I understand it, Roger, I'm talking with some parks personnel, and Nat can talk more eloquently to this. But as I understand it, you look at the southern part of Harbor Island, all the way up to the northern tip of Hoffmaster, that is virtually an ecological treasure. It's incredibly unique, and it has such attention and unique characteristics with the habitat and the migratory aspects. It's got one of the largest concentrations of unique bird species in all of Ottawa County in that area. The Audubon Society, National Park Service, that is of high interest to them on what is happening in that space. And again, it's my understanding the National Park Service is investing some time and resources as well to help develop a conservation plan for potential implementation along that whole unique world gem of a shoreline with its ecological features. Depending, I think, again, Nat can talk more to this, but I believe once that study is done, it could take a couple years to do, but I think it opens up a lot of opportunities for our park system to consider how to enhance and protect that area and even evolve it into a world-class ecotourism site. It's incredibly unique. I mean, you're talking about the shoreline of one of the largest fresh bodies of water in the world, and at the confluence of the largest river in the state of Michigan with these migratory bird features. It is of extreme relevance and importance ecologically.
Okay, I'm going to segue into just giving Nate's background now, and then we'll let him expound a little bit more on that question. Nate Miller is the Director of Conservation for the National Audubon Society, Great Lakes and Upper Mississippi Flyway. Nate holds a MA in International Environmental Policy from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. After earning his degree, he spent a decade working in the Caribbean and Central America, managing parks and establishing protected area policy before joining Audubon in 2014. Nat now leads a conservation and science team that looks to birds to inform ecosystem management. Audubon Great Lakes is a new initiative launched in 2016, has ambitious goals to restore and protect the waters of the Great Lakes and thousands of acres of coastal areas that provide important habitat for hundreds of species of migratory land birds and breeding marsh birds, both of which have experienced significant declines in population over the past several decades. Nat serves as a board member of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Upper Mississippi River and Great Lakes Joint Venture Science Team, and on the board of the Great Lakes Coastal Assembly. So with that, Nat, I'll let you continue on about birds.
Thank you, Roger, and Paul as well is a perfect setup. If you want to click to the next slide, I'll build on Paul's comments about the region's significance, especially to birds, but really to wildlife as a whole. This is a recent study map resulting from a study from Michigan Natural Features Inventory looking at radar data, which can pick up bird migration, some really cutting edge science that informs the most important places for birds. And because of this region's location in transition, what we call ecotone, a transition of ecosystems from the kind of more northern hardwoods to more southerly forests, and because of the location on the coast and the Grand River, this area is really, really important for migratory land birds, especially we see here densities in spring, but spring and fall migration. We know now that birds migrate along the coastal lines, a lot of times migrating over the lake itself at night and then quickly coming to shore at dawn to avoid predation and to stop and refuel. And the map on the right is why we got so excited several years ago with Ottawa Sands, along with many others, to work with Ottawa County Parks. And you can see it fills in a gap that Paul was describing of an impressive corridor of habitat and land management that merges with a teeing intersection of the Grand River and protected habitat there. And thought this map was good to look at again because there's a small gap on that map that is the sim site within on Harbor Island. So if you go to the next slide, this just shows a suite of species that Audubon is paying particularly close attention to, and many partners are in the Great Lakes region. We call them secretive marsh birds. They're rapidly declining alongside the loss of wetland habitat and the degradation of wetlands. These birds rely on high quality native wetland habitat in the summer to successfully reproduce, and they're not doing so. We're seeing dramatic declines over the last 30 to 40 years, even after the Clean Water Act, and now we're seeing that more associated with the degradation rather than just the loss of habitat. Some species like black tern there on the left have lost nearly half their population in the last 3 decades. And it's common gallinule, Sora rail, and pied-billed grebe for those birders on the call that are interested. Those are all species that are of conservation concern. Many of these, about 16 species or so, are on Michigan state threatened and endangered list. So if you go to the next slide, some of our science work has looked at identifying the most important areas for these birds across all of the Great Lakes coastal wetlands. And if we get to that next slide, you'll see a map that is a spatial model using bird data, breeding bird data, historical data, as well as the potential to restore wetlands. And another reason why we're so excited to work with our membership in Michigan and in eastern Lake Michigan, where across the state of Michigan, Audubon has about 30,000 members, and Ottawa County, we have approximately 1,500 members. But that area at the river mouth in Ottawa Sands, that's zoomed in on the top right there. It's a model, but we're picking up birds, and historically, because of, I love the historic photos. Even before some of those, that was a massive wetland at the mouth of the river, right, which is super important for climate resiliency as well, as we know wetlands absorb and hold and clean water. So these are areas that we're focused on and trying to have conversations about restoring. And that's why we're involved in some of the regional planning that Paul mentioned as well, with Ottawa County Parks and many others to see if we can create habitat for these wildlife that really need it.
So Nat, Nat, can you explain the coloring, the red color, the green, what are we seeing there?
Yeah, so the darker the red, the higher density or the higher priority for wetland habitat for a suite of about 16 species of breeding marsh birds, including those 4 that I just mentioned. So, sorry, I've got my son in the background. So we've actually picked up on surveys on Harbor Island, Sora, common gallinule, which is a state threatened species, marsh wren, which is a species of conservation concern, blue-winged teal, Virginia rail, least bittern. This map in the darker, deeper red shows us the importance and the potential to provide habitat for those birds.
Okay.
And then I just want to mention that where birds are, people are in many ways, right? We know what's good for birds is good for people, but also people love to see birds, and wanted to give a shout out to some of our members. They call themselves the Harbor Island Girls there, who monitor these birds. And there's a site called eBird that allows you to digitally record your bird list and site. And Harbor Island is the #1 eBird site in our entire planning region, which is basically that map there on the left. So a lot of people love to bird there and love to see birds and help contribute to our community science initiatives.
Wonderful. Anybody else have anything they wish to add? Okay. Thank you, Nat. The next question is, what is the potential of this being a larger brownfield site with cleanup the island sometime in the future? Paul, I know that you have dealt with some brownfield sites in the past. I don't know if you have any information about this, and then Kent, maybe you can answer in a few minutes too, and maybe Eric. I'm not sure, but we'll start with Paul.
Yep. Sounds good, Roger. Yeah, the funding for brownfield remediation for this particular site, it's challenging the way it's current ownership dealing with liable party. I mean, opportunities would open up through EPA and other sources if there would be an exchange of property to a private entity. Does open up some areas to consider for source funding. I think in light of what Nat's talking about and other opportunities along the shoreline, potentially the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding could be a consideration. That's 8 federal agencies joining together and offering funding sources for, I think, unique environments just like this, with requiring remediation with the ecological significance. I think more to explore on that front, most definitely, and I'll see who else has more to add.
Anybody else, Eric or Kent?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about the economic opportunities that this sort of restoration opens up. So I just finished a project up in Muskegon Lake where the Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA and several agencies spent the better part of a decade rehabilitating the lake, removing legacy contaminants, restoring the shoreline to a more natural condition. And my colleagues and I at Grand Valley State University looked at the economic impact that that the lake restoration had. And we found that people are more interested in buying homes in near the lake where it's been restored to a more natural shoreline. That's an appealing aspect to a property. And because of that, we found in places where the shoreline was restored, housing values increased, taking into consideration all the other factors. And that led to more than $7 million of additional housing value attributed directly to the improvements in the lake, specifically the lakeshore restoration. And cleaning up the lake has encouraged more people to come out and engage in lake-based recreation, such as boating, fishing, and walking on the trails around the lake. And so visitation is up, more people are coming out on the lake, and the value of that additional recreation, we estimated to be about $27 million a year. So this is a huge benefit to the community. That was in Muskegon, and you can, speculate, imagine what a sort of a rehabilitation of Harbor Island, which is right in downtown Grand Haven, what that could do to the tourism economy and for people who live here year round.
Okay. Kent, do you have any thoughts?
The Brownfield program in the state of Michigan is a pretty specialty program. I'm not involved with it too much, but I would encourage anyone who's interested to reach out to our Brownfield specialists. They work with the remediation and redevelopment division. There's one that sits a couple cubes. Well, back when we were all sitting in cubes, a couple cubes away from me. And I'm always hearing her doing various really, really cool work across the state of redeveloping sites that have, significant environmental impacts and developing them into areas that are just, really cool, either recreational areas or commerce, shopping areas or something like that. So if you're interested, I could always try to get you in contact with the right person.
Okay. Thanks, Kent. Nat, do you have anything you want to add? I mean, obviously, birding is for a very specialized group of people, but that has become more popular. Is that correct?
1 in 3 Americans consider themselves birders.
1 in 3 Americans. That's great.
Yeah, no, I mean, on the question, I'm familiar with Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and EPA brownfields, and I think this would be suitable, at least to pursue some feasibility aspect of it. And from our perspective on climate change is the #1 threat to birds, combined with habitat loss, and those are interwoven issues for birds, right? So we have goals to get to net zero as well. And I think, finding opportunities to do that work on the energy front and provide habitat for birds would be an incredible win for those species, of course, but also for people that enjoy them and benefit from the same healthy environments.
Good. Okay, we have one final question before we get to the audience. Considering the election that we just went through, what are your thoughts regarding the future state or federal policy changes that we might see regarding the usage of fossil fuels, possible carbon tax, fee, or a dividend, or and on the use of Harbor Island? Anybody want to venture into that one?
Sure, I can jump in.
Okay.
So I looked into the plan, the technical plan that talked about the proposed natural gas generator that's being considered. They used, a couple of different price estimates, a low price estimate and a high price estimate. And if I don't have a crystal ball, I don't know if a carbon tax or a carbon fee or cap and trade is in the works, but if it were, probably a reasonable estimate for a well-priced carbon tax would be about $50 per ton of carbon. There's a technical term called the social cost of carbon. That's approximately the best estimate right now, but it's kind of a minimum threshold. That would translate to about $2.66 per 1,000 cubic feet of natural gas. So without a carbon tax, the current price of natural gas is $2.92 per 1,000 cubic feet. With a carbon tax of about $50, that would add another $2.66 to come out to $5.58 per 1,000 cubic feet. So that would almost double the price of natural gas for this power plant that's being proposed, which would be in line with the high estimate in that report. So when we think about this as a low cost generating option, that really doesn't pan out when we start to think about what are the external costs of fossil fuel, for burning fossil fuels. And that really doesn't even talk about the upstream impacts of methane and natural gas extraction and fracking. That's really just in the burning of it.
Right.
So yeah, a carbon tax or fee or some sort of price on carbon may be coming forward, but that would probably double the fuel costs.
Anybody else want to venture in on that question?
Yeah, I may add a little bit to that as well. Nat mentioned a couple times climate change, and I think that word is not going to be as obscure as scary to many people. I think that science is going to be more prevalent. I hope it becomes more prevalent and really start to understand it and look thoroughly at full renewable energy sources in light of where we see the trends going with climate change. I hope there's a lot more attention placed on this, and back to the previous points in this discussion, that I hope when we look at the potential for Harbor Island, we take in consideration climate change impacts that are impacting coastal environments like what we're dealing with right now. I think it must be looked at. I don't know if it has been looked at with what's being considered, but we can't avoid it. There's science behind this, and we need to put scientific evaluation into the best and highest use of this site.
Good. Thank you, Paul.
Welcome.
So if there's nothing else, I've got a couple of questions that came in. I'll throw the first one out is, and this reminds me a little bit of when I was on the city council many years ago. We had an issue with a toxic plume that was coming across the city at quite a I don't know how far down it was under the surface, but it was a toxic plume that was coming from the eastern side of the city, and it was making its way across the city. It was not from the eastern, it was from the southern part of the city, and it was making its way down towards the Grand River. So this question that someone posed is, do you know the direction of the plume on the toxic surface water, and is it going into Lake Michigan? So maybe Kent, maybe you could answer that question.
Yeah, right now what we have is groundwater information. So that basically means they installed monitoring wells, which are these tubes that go into the ground, and then you can put sampling tubes down it and then draw that water up and then test it for certain for certain contaminants. So that's the information that we have as far as the direction that it's moving. Now I'll try not to get too technical in geology land here, but the island, as we all know, is very flat. There's not much elevation to it. It's also an island. It's in the middle of a river. So there's water all around it. Groundwater gradients are very affected by the level of the stream, the level of the Grand River, a precipitation event. So if we had a large precipitation event, that could potentially change groundwater flow directions. So it's very dependent. In my opinion, it's probably on a weekly basis. And from the information that I have seen to this date, groundwater flow has been pretty much in any which direction that you can think of on the site. There has been some predominant groundwater flows directions that have sort of trended over time, predominantly to the east or predominantly to the west. But it's just very dependent on really what's going on at the site. Like I said, if there's a large rain event, it could flow one direction. If there is, if the Grand River is flooding, it could flow a different direction. So there's not really a, a for sure direction that it's moving. We know it's moving towards surface water. We know that. But on a given day, it could be, it's variable. It's very dynamic. It changes very fast.
Okay. All right. So the next question we have is the current large pond bordered by the soccer fields and the boat launch an ash pond? And as I read this one, I'm thinking that if they're talking about the pond, I'm trying to visualize. I walk out to the island often and take my bike out there, and I'm thinking that if they're referring to the pond that is next to the highway, that is, I don't believe that's an ash pond. I think that's just a wetland area, and that's, and I can't think of if the other one is they're talking about between this. That's the one I'm talking about to the east of the soccer fields. If to the west of the soccer fields is there isn't an ash pond. I don't believe it would be an ash pond, but do you know,
Yeah,
Kent?
I can comment on that a little bit. So yeah, south of the boat launch, west of the soccer fields, it's not what you would consider a pond that was used for ash disposal. That historically has more or less been a wetland, a bayou area.
Yeah.
However, we are working with the BLP because one of their historic ponds, it historically had an outlet channel that discharged to that wetland. So we're working with the BLP. They need to, one of the asks that Eagle had for the BLP was to let's take a look at the information that we have and see exactly where ash is in the ground, because we know that there is a channel that discharged to the north historically. So that, we got to determine, we got to figure out if it was possible for ash to flow out in that direction. So, but that whole area is not an ash pond. If you could look through Google Earth, flip through the images, you can see it's remained consistently, and even the historical aerial images, you can see it's remained a wetland area. Yeah.
Okay, the next question is kind of interesting.
I was just gonna add to that, Roger, if I may. That is one of the sites that we're monitoring as well, that our community scientists are monitoring and picking up birds. So, and then I wanted to just throw out there, in addition to the kind of the secret of marsh birds, there's a total of 215 species I wanted to mention that have been recorded on Harbor Island. Really impressive number.
Yeah. And so those two areas that I just mentioned, the one that's that Kent was just talking about, plus the one that's next to the highway, there's I've seen a lot of birds there myself. Those two areas are, we used to call the one that's next to the highway, we used to call that Old Kent Pond. And because the bank owned that property for many years, and then they, while I was on the city council, Fifth Third had purchased the bank at that time, and then they gave it to the city. So the city owns that property now, but it used to be owned by the bank. Anyway, the next question is, if your desire is to manage water levels on Harbor Island, have you considered a dike system used in many national wildlife refuge and wastewater facilities? Interesting question. I don't know that, I haven't heard anything like that, but do you know of anybody, Nat, that's using something like that for a wildlife refuge?
Yeah, yep. We've worked in dike systems in a lot of places. I think here, just off the cuff, it would be really difficult to consider that, or it would be an engineering feat. That actually the Army Corps likes to take on big challenges like that, but just because of the nature of the island itself and the river, of course, is directly associated with the lake, there would have to be a lot of diking to separate that and be able to manage water levels. But yes, I mean, having the ability to manage water levels does provide a climate adaptation tool, right? But I'm not sure if anybody's looked at that for our island.
Yeah, and in many respects, isn't it almost advisable? You know, there's a natural ebb and flow of water on the island, and aren't we better off leaving well enough alone?
It's a good question, and I think it's up for debate, especially with what we talked about before with rapid fluctuations of water levels and the unpredictable nature of climate change and what that's going to do to our water levels. But yes, healthy wetlands do depend on an ebb and flow, usually a slower ebb and flow than what we've seen, as Paul discussed, from 2013 to 2019. But yes. You can recreate that with managed waters. Some will argue to not the same extent, obviously. But
Okay. So here's the next question. Is there opportunity for public, private, and nonprofits to form coalitions to apply for EPA Superfund or Brownfield funds? And are there examples in Michigan? You want to put that on? There you go. Okay. Anybody want to tackle that one?
There are, Ottawa County on 2 different occasions has received EPA brownfield assessment funding. We've done it singularly as just a county, but I know across the state and nationally, there have been collaborations of multiple jurisdictions joining together to apply for brownfield assessment and cleanup funds. So that certainly is I would venture a possibility, yes. Again, those, even Kent mentioned it too, those restrictions are pretty tight on EPA brownfield dollars, and you'd have to be, again, looking at the liable party, it would have to be a sale of the site to another entity to open up those opportunities, based on my understanding.
Excuse me. Just for information, there's a storm going on right now. So if we happen to lose power, I don't know how we get back, but so we've got lightning and thunder and a rainstorm going on. So just an FYI, okay?
I'm good. Hang in there, Roger.
Pardon? So the next question is, are there plans to expand Grand River Greenway from Grand Rapids to Grand Haven across the island? Could the site be connected with Ottawa Sands by a ferry?
I will say that there are no plans at the moment, but previous discussions based on the work of Nat and what's happening with conservation planning along that entire corridor up to North Pika Hoffmaster. And once we start to take a look at the opportunities, then we can dive in a little bit deeper and see how county parks could get involved in expanding it through the Greenway. Ferry ideas as a really fun one, but I don't think we're at that point yet to develop plans.
All right. The next question is, what is the environmental impact of the proposed BLP building on the ability to remediate all the CCR pits? Kent?
Yeah, the environmental impact of the proposed BLP building on the ability to remediate all CCR pits. So, I mean, they're required by law to have closure of the CCR ponds. So it wouldn't be a wise idea to build a fancy new building on pits that you have to remediate before remediating them. So they need to remediate them first. So that would assumably be, doing something to prevent contaminants from being released into the environment. So, you know, I'm not exactly sure what they're proposing to build on the island, but as we've talked about earlier, brownfields, there's areas to build on areas with contamination that helps lower the risk for impact to human health or the environment. But like I said, they're required by law to remediate these areas where the CCR coal ash has been disposed of historically from the plant.
Okay, the next question is, how would higher water levels impact proposed borderline power building usability? So there, Kent, I don't know if you saw the site plan, but the site plan is that they're planning on not just building this peaking plant, but also their office building would be part of that structure as well. So the question is higher water levels, how that would impact the usability of that building.
Well, I would say that if it's underwater, it'd be more difficult to enter the building. The city's master plan, the coastal resiliency plan, they have multiple scenarios built in on what could happen with fluctuations in water levels, from lucky scenarios, expected scenarios, worst case scenarios. To dive into that data a little bit further, and you could see you put a structure on that site, where's the water level in terms of relation to the footings? I mean, and again, if there's going to be a consideration of site development and new construction at that location, it needs to include an assessment of these aspects. I mean, we're in a really unique coastal region with fluctuating water levels that you'd be remiss if you didn't incorporate that into your building design. That would have to happen before this would go anywhere.
Okay. All right. So the next question is, do any of you have a sense of the extent of environmental damage on the island other than the BLP wasteland? So I guess the question is about the extent of the damage that has been done to the island in the past. Specifically, probably they're talking about the fact that it was a dump site.
Yeah, I don't have any specifics, but I mean, you showed the history in those photos earlier, which was really compelling. It's a totally, changed environment, from, logging waste and, sawmill residues and things like that, to trash and trash burning, to coal ash ponds. It has a legacy of a lot of manipulation and abuse. But I mean, nature is also real resilient. And like Nat said, 215 different bird species currently use the island, even in the state that it's in. So, yeah, it's a pretty remarkable asset to the city and the community.
So there's a couple of questions here that really aren't relevant. So I'm going to, the last one is, can the BLP avoid cleanup by building the new $25 to $30 million buildings? Cleanup by building the new.
No. So these CCR rules and the Michigan CCROs, they apply to all power plants across Michigan. The required steps are, you look at your coal ash impoundments, you figure out if they're impacting groundwater. If they're impacting groundwater, then you have a, subset of steps you need to take to try to remediate that groundwater. And then you need to close out those coal ash impoundments, because they're just, it's just old technology. I don't think any of us would agree that just placing, waste on unlined pits is a good idea anymore. It was common practice back in the day, but it just wouldn't be a good idea anymore. So that's why they're being required to close. It doesn't matter what the future is for the island. They will need to be closed.
Okay, so I don't have any other questions at this time. So I'm gonna just ask if you guys have anything further you want to just add before we wrap this up. Kent, do you have anything you want to add or suggest?
I don't think I have anything. I always like to make myself available to anyone who is interested to learn more about what we're doing at the site, specifically to the coal ash stuff. I don't think my email was on the opening slide, but if Andrea or you, Roger, or someone wants, you could always provide that to anyone who's interested. And I always try to be as transparent and available to anyone who's interested about learning anything about the site. So I just encourage people to reach out if they're curious about the site.
I'll extend the same, Roger. If any additional questions by anyone, feel free to contact our office as well.
Yeah, likewise. And this is just a remarkable opportunity. Like this moment, these types of moments don't come around very often. And, this kind of transformative period is scary in many ways because we don't know exactly what's going to happen. And we're moving to brand new energy resources. But it's also really exciting to see what could revitalized, rehabilitated, restored Harbor Island do for the community here in the Tri-Cities. So I'm really excited about it, and I look forward to seeing what happens.
Okay, I just had somebody just texted me about this last question, which was, can the BLP avoid cleanup by building the new $25 to $30 million building? And the question refers to if they have built there, keep the island as an industrial use, and would that prevent all the dump and other waste from having to be cleaned up?
I can't vouch for the dump that's historically there. That's not directly related to my program, but like I mentioned before, the CCR coal ash wastes, they're required to be closed and cleaned up by specific deadlines. There are power plant. There's one power plant here in West Michigan that basically closed out all of their online ponds and then constructed a self-contained concrete holding tank for their wastes, and it never touches the ground. It's never stored on the ground, and it's shipped to landfills. But all these unlined coal ash ponds, they have to be closed on certain timelines.
Okay, all right. Okay, again, thank you all for participating. Nat, thanks for coming in and representing the Audubon. Interesting concept. One I hadn't really thought about too much before, but as I mentioned earlier, I get out there quite often, and I've seen some rather unusual birds there. And I remember it wasn't too long ago that I took a picture of, you have those white swans that are in some of those ponds. And this one day I was going and I saw brown ones, and I've never seen brown ones before. And I sent the picture to my daughter-in-law and I said, look, I've seen brown swans. And she says, no, those aren't brown swans. You're imagining, those aren't swans. And I know they were swans. They were swimming around with the white ones, and they weren't fighting each other. And I don't know what kind they were, but they were beautiful. So what were they, Nat?
I'd have to see a picture to be able to accurately identify that.
Okay, all right. I
mean,
thought you'd be able to tell.
You got 3 potential species of swan there, but they're all white, so I know it was
Yeah,
unless
they
it
were
was
definitely-
juvenile.
They were definitely, no, they were good sized and they were brown. And anyway, so in the future, we'd like to ask people to mark their calendars for November 12th at 4 o'clock is the Grand Haven Board Light Power Board meeting. You can go to their website and participate in that. On November 16th, they also will have the Grand Haven City Council meeting will be, and on a date to be determined, we would like to have a panel discussion on the commercial and industrial ratepayers and the BLP, and that's something that Grand Haven Energy is working on putting together in the future as well. So Paul, Nat, Eric, Kent, thank you for participating. I don't see any other questions coming in. I think that our person who is moving the slides has a couple more slides she's going to be putting on. One that talks about methane gas. There it is. And the impacts of methane gas. And then there's a couple more. And these are on our website also. So you can take a look at these. This talks about the methane is 80 times more potent than carbon. And then keep the questions coming. Stay tuned on Facebook and YouTube for Q&As with current and past panelists, which means that Eric, Nat, Paul, Kent, if we have your email addresses and we get some questions in for any of you, we may send those your way. We're good?
Be glad to try to answer them.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
And with that, I think we are finished.
Thank you. Nice conversation.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Eric, Nat, and Kent. Pleasure to
Yes,
be on the panel with you.
yes. It was a great conversation. Thank you all for participating. And out in the audience, thank you for listening and watching. And again, check out Grand Haven Energy on Facebook, Grand Haven Energy on YouTube, and Grand Haven GHenergy.org. Thank you.